This is the Aurelius Podcast, episode 57 with Phil Hesketh. I'm Zach Naylor, co-founder at Aurelius, and your host for the podcast, where we discuss all things UX, research, and product. In this episode, we have Phil Hesketh. Phil is the founder of ConsentKit, which is a UX research tool that helps teams gather and manage consent from their participants and do that at scale. Phil joined us to chat in great depth about gathering and managing consent from research participants and managing that data and consent at scale. He talked about their platform, but also went into a ton of detail about gathering consent. We talked about the difference between consent and informed consent, why it matters, and how it can impact your research in a lot of ways. We also talked about staying legally compliant in doing UX research work and the implications of things like GDPR, and how to stay on the up and up to protect ourselves and our participants. This podcast is brought to you by Aurelius, the powerful research repository and insights platform. Aurelius is an all-in-one space for researchers to organize and analyze data, capture insights, and share outcomes with your team. Transcribe audio, visualize themes, capture findings, and have a report created for you automatically, which you can share with anyone in moments. Check us out at aureliuslab.com. That's AURELIUSLAB.com. Okay, let's get to it.
Hey.
How's it going?
Yeah, good. Thanks. How you doing?
Awesome. Appreciate you jumping on and joining us for the show today. Would love for you to maybe introduce yourself, talk a little bit about what you do and your background. So for folks listening, if they don't already know who you are, give them a sense of who we're chatting with today.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Phil Hesketh. I'm the founder of ConsentKit. So we are a platform to help research and design teams to obtain and manage informed consent and do that operationally at scale. So my background predominantly is in design. I've been a user researcher and do more research in the last sort of 4 or 5 years or so. Before that, for about 10 years, I was in UX design, and I'm based here in sunny Manchester in the UK.
Sunny Manchester. I don't know if I've ever heard that many places in the UK described as sunny. Are you being cheeky, or is it honestly sunny there?
A little bit, but it is actually sunny at the moment, which is unusual. So I'm feeling a bit more confident about the weather here than normal.
Okay. And see, that's the reason I ask, is because I've never lived in the UK, but I understand that the summers can be cloudy and gloomy. Is that right?
Yeah, they're definitely, they keep you on your toes. It's like sunglasses and waterproofs at all times.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that you're prepared. Anyway, thanks again for jumping on to chat about this stuff, particularly what you're doing with ConsentKit and how that pertains to research. I think is a very useful topic, especially for the people who tend to listen to this show, which are mostly UX researchers, product researchers, even market researchers, right? Mm-hmm. So let's maybe zoom all the way out when we talk about consent and things like that with research. I mean, just what does that actually even mean? So for folks who aren't already thinking about that or maybe unfamiliar, what does that even mean?
Yeah, so there's actually a difference between just consent and informed consent as well. And I think it's worth calling that out, is that consent is typically you agree to the terms of some kind of engagement or relationship with someone. Whereas informed consent is really much more, there's a lot more detail. It's not just a simple question of, are you happy to take part or not? It's like you need to know a bunch of stuff beforehand so that you can make a reasonable decision about whether or not you want to take part and you're happy with what's about to happen. So for example, like in the context of research, it's things like, what is the project about? Like maybe why you're talking to them, what they might expect from the session, what kind of information you're going to record, like what you're going to do with that information, like who else is going to see it. And then also what are their rights under, various data protection laws, which might be applicable to them. So in Europe and for European citizens, that's GDPR, for example. So what rights do they have to that? And then how can they actually exercise those rights if they want to?
Yeah, for sure. And GDPR is, I think, probably the best example. In the US, there's CCPA, which is very similar. It's almost US version of GDPR and in a simplified explanation, I suppose. I'm curious, how did this become such a central focus for you, that you said this is a challenge that we want to help people solve? Yeah,
sure. So it's actually started for me probably back in mid-2016, and I became really interested in design. I just retrained to do a master's, and at the time got to write as a part of the thesis for that. I was really looking at just opportunity to spend 3 or 4 months to really deep dive into something. So I started to, when I was trying to find a topic for that, I started to really look at design itself and like where design was going and what was happening. And I noticed that there was a thing called the Design Index, and the Design Index was basically, they tracked the Standard & Poor 500 or the S&P 500, and they tracked 50 companies who were using design as a strategy or a strategic level in terms of decision making within the organization. So That's like the highest level of this design maturity model. And they tracked them over a period of 10 years, and they saw that these companies like massively outperformed everybody else. So it was like, I think it was like 213% more than others. So I had this bet that, okay, design is really like a strategic differentiator for businesses and for organizations when they can get to that level. And I also sort of started to think, well, where has that impact been, like the most? And I noticed that really it was in the consumer marketplace. And if you look at like the proliferation of the internet, it was almost totally saturated, and there's been huge disruption over that with the last sort of 10 or 20 years. Is what the internet's done to that industry. And then I started to also then look like, well, where hasn't it gone? Things like healthcare, education, government, financial, like all of these things hadn't really been as sort of affected at the time. And I just made a bet. I was like, okay, well, companies either moving into this space to disrupt them, or companies who are maybe going to diversify because they can't really go much further in the consumer space are going to move into this. And if we then start to bring design as a strategy into that, like we're potentially dealing with more and more vulnerable people and more vulnerable audiences. And it was like, are we prepared as designers to do that? So there's no, at the time, certainly, like, and probably still the case, is there's not much of a sort of formal education around things like consent, data management and stuff. And it's still a bit like the Wild West in terms of like how we're doing stuff. And we're now starting to, obviously this, since 2018, we've had the GDPR and these data regulations are becoming more and more of a thing. But certainly in these industries, like healthcare, for example, and fintech, it's like a much, much more regulated. So you have to be a lot more careful about how we approach things and what we do. And so I started to really pay attention to sort of design teams, and I was really interested in ethics and being like, how do these kind of conversations happen and what's going on? And as I was doing that research, I noticed that informed consent really was like an afterthought almost. Or it was something that people would do, and they would maybe get a consent form from a previous project, copy it over and just sort of use that again. And then when GDPR came out, all of a sudden, this kind of relationship with data became way, way more prevalent. It wasn't just about ethics in terms of, are we doing the right thing? It was actually like, oh, there's this kind of risk now for organizations who aren't doing this. And it felt like informed consent for me was really sat right in the middle of all of that. And I think that obviously there's a huge ethical component to informed consent and all of the challenges that kind of wrap around that, but also really in terms of an opportunity, for example, to create psychological safety for people, to give them it's like a legal mechanism for them to pull out or to change their mind and all these kind of things. But also, there was this regulatory risk as well, which is like, actually, we need to be able to evidence the fact that we have permission to use the data in this way. And then beyond that, really, it was like, okay, well, actually, like there's so many innovations now in terms of like research repositories and stuff like this. And also against this backdrop of like democratizing research, that there just felt like loads and loads of challenges, loads and loads of question marks just around this kind of fairly innocuous form which sits in the middle of this process.
Yeah. Okay. Really interesting. I mean, there's a lot that you shared there and a couple points that I want to touch on a little bit deeper. I mean, as opposed, or I should say, with regard to consent versus informed consent, I think that makes enough sense, right? Like, it's one thing to gather consent, but it's another to make sure that somebody really understands what they are consenting to, what their rights to that data are, and all those things. The one thing you touched on with that is, I'm sure it sounds familiar to people, is like, we got a consent form from a past research project, plug and play, reuse that, and had somebody use it again. I'm going to ask the obvious questions because I want to hear your answers to them, right? But what's the problem with that? Why shouldn't researchers do that if they are today?
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to informed consent, really. It's like a lot of the times what I see is this kind of a very general consent form, which kind of covers a huge amount of processing potentially that could happen. And it's not really particularly specific. And I think when you look at the requirements that are specified in the GDPR, for example, for actually obtaining informed consent, is you need to demonstrate a few things. Like, one is not only like what the person was asked and what was given in that form, but also like how the person was asked as well, and like when they were asked. So all of these things about like they kind of like wrap around that, really. So if you have a very broad general thing, there's a pretty good chance that if you ever, for example, went to court, which may or may not be likely, it's hard to tell, that could actually get thrown out, and you say, well, actually, this isn't adequate. It doesn't really meet the requirements of this. I mean, that's probably the biggest thing. I think as well is, I think the other thing, just from a more kind of human aspect of it, is that it's really like an opportunity. It's like a lot of the times, like we use like really weird language, right? So you'll say to someone, hey, do you want to come and do a usability test? And it's like, what's a usability test? If you're not in our sort of bubble, we use all these very weird words. We're going to interview you about this thing, whatever. And people get nervous and people don't really understand what these things are. And then if you imagine you bring like eye tracking into that or something else as well, and people are like freaking out, what are we going into? Because I think there's probably a sliding scale as well. And if you're doing like a checkout experience or something like that, is like one thing. But if you're talking about someone's experiences with an illness or something like that, or you're trying to understand more discovery stuff in like a health space, you're potentially collecting like a lot more data, but also you're talking about things which may be either previously traumatic for someone or maybe, quite difficult for someone to talk about. So I would say one of the main benefits for me is of using this like thing up front is that you're actually saying, look, this is what we're going to talk about. And you can maybe either prepare yourself for it, but also you have the ability to actually say no if you want to. It's actually, I'm not comfortable talking about this, or I'm not comfortable with what you're going to do with this data afterwards. So I think obviously there is the compliance like risk there, but I think really for me, the main benefit of not, just taking a cookie cutter sort of approach to using previous consent forms is that you're missing this huge opportunity to actually just remove or address some of those anxieties really, and just communicate really clearly and plainly with someone before they turn up to the session. And I've personally been in sessions before where we've been talking about usability testing. Someone's really clamped up, they're very closed. And then as soon as you get to the end of an interview and you're like, okay, I'm going to stop recording now, they just suddenly breathe this sigh of relief, and it's okay. And then the answers start coming out and they suddenly unwind and they realize it's not actually that big of a deal, right? And I think one of the things with informed consent is you can get people closer to that and more comfortable before you start the actual session. So that obviously means you're going to get better outcomes as well and better, research.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Actually, that last story was really useful, I think, for folks to hear. One of the things that I used to do when I was doing research for other companies, if it was usability testing, I would actually sandwich that with sort of mini interviews for that very reason, because it happened all the time, right? Like when you're doing research with somebody, especially in these contexts, you often don't actually know who that person is. And you're asking them questions that could feel very intimate or sort of private for them, but it's going to help you, make better decisions. And so that's tough because you haven't established maybe enough rapport or sort of a level of comfort with them. And so that definitely makes a lot of sense. And I guess the two big points that I pulled out of your answer to that question was really the reason why you should do this is, number one, risk mitigation. So legally speaking, there are certain requirements that we have to meet. GDPR, particularly in the UK and the EU, is one of them, not one of them, the one, I would say, right? But then reason number two is it sounds to me like it can help you do better research. It can help you build some of that confidence and rapport in relationship with that person so that they feel maybe a little bit more comfortable kind of getting right to the meat of or the heart of the matter that you're looking to learn.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that just to build on that usability test as a term as well is one of the times we started to follow up with people and we did consent very verbally, and it was much like a conversation where we were trying to design what are the things people need to know and how can we communicate that best with them. And one of the main things that came back from usability testing was people were saying I think you're going to test me and I don't want to look stupid. It was just it's not about that at all. So we put this extra bit in there where we're not testing you, we're testing the product. And if you can't do it, or if something doesn't make sense, that's actually super useful for us to find out. Yeah.
And the one thing that you just said there, to me, it was just a very nice, subtle revelation, is actually having the conversation about consent rather than just handing somebody a form and saying, we need you to sign this so it's okay. We record and do all. It makes it feel very clinical. It makes it feel like you're some kind of guinea pig, like we're almost doing medical tests on you or something like that for a new shampoo or something like that, right? But to your point, I think that's really subtle, but big impact that can have to say, well, we're going to talk with this person. It's not just this thing we're going to sign, but we're going to talk with you about here's what we're doing. Here's why we're doing it. Here's what we plan on learning. Here's what it's not. Here's all the rights that you have on this. It just maybe helps put their mind at ease. And it's not just asking them to read the fine print on something, which, let's face it, either A, nobody does, or B, they don't fully understand. And then to your point, maybe feel uncomfortable with.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I think that most researchers will know this stuff, right? They're really good at building a bit of rapport. They're really good at breaking the ice. They're really good at explaining this. One of the trends I see with this democratization of research is we get a lot of people who are not researchers, who don't have that sort of formal training or don't have that background, who are coming into this. And I'd count myself as well amongst those people. I'm not a classically trained researcher. It's just I've read a few books and got involved. When you see describing informed consent, it's almost like a checkbox. But it's actually, I think this thing is a really big opportunity for a bigger thing within the part of what we're doing. Because also, what I normally do when we do a session is obviously send the consent form, try to get it at least a week ahead of time, because it gives them some time to think about it and read it. You don't want them to be sort of rushing through this thing. And then at the beginning of the session, I'll say to them, so normally we have these granular options in consent kit where you can say, I'm happy to be recorded on the screen, or I'm happy for audio to be recorded or whatever. So at the beginning of the session, I'll say, do you have any questions about the content of the consent document? And I'll sort of talk them through that. And then just say, I know you've told us this, so this is what I've done in response to what you've told me, and show them that you have some control. And then usually, because you don't know where the conversation is going to go, at the end of the session, I'll be like, okay, now we've finished talking about this and we actually know what we've spoken about. Was there anything that, that we said in that session that you weren't comfortable with, or another chance really to be like, okay, yeah, this bit, that bit, and redact that as you go forward? Because really that the consent is almost like, maybe come on to this in a little bit more detail after, but like the consent form is almost then like a distribution license for that, what you can do with that data going forwards. And I think in this kind of world of repos, which is like an amazing thing because we're still trying to sort of prove the worth of research a lot of the time in organizations, but also when you think about this design as a strategic sort of decision-making tool within organizations, it makes a ton of sense to do this. And also it's more ethical because you're not asking the same questions over and over again to people. So it makes total sense like to have repos. But I think that presents like a new bunch of challenges as well, because the way what happens to this data and our responsibilities to that data also change. It's not as simple as, hey, I'm going to delete this, no one else is going to see this. That nature has gone from like a push where I am the researcher and I am controlling who sees that and the publication of those findings within the organization, to like a pull where it's like anyone in the organization can access that and see it, and they don't necessarily know what they can do and what they can't do with that, right?
Yeah, for sure. And so where you started on that was something that I wanted to ask too. I mean, I think it seems obvious where, of course, you have to obtain consent before doing research with people. I wanted to ask, I mean, in terms of doing it to this depth and this thoroughly, like where does that fall in the process? Is it more than just simply upfront?
Yeah, I think this is really why we built Consent Kit, is that it's really difficult to, you might get one or two people in an organization who are really hot on this and they're like really good at it. They understand what they need to include in the forms and they can write them and stuff. But when you start to scale that process up, it's difficult for people to do that. And the main thing is consistency, really, with any kind of data governance and data management. You need to be logging what you're doing consistently. You want to be asking consistently, and then also managing that data consistently as well, and like deleting it afterwards. And it starts with, I think, what we saw at like the very early prototypes we were using, we were doing things like Google Forms and spreadsheets and like munging stuff together like that and trying to figure out something that would work for us. And a lot of the time, the emphasis really fell in the planning sort of stage of research, how you would put a research project together. And then, but then after the fact, we realized actually this thing afterwards, like if you say, okay, our retention policy is like 12 months, for example, we're going to keep your recording for 12 months. So you've got this like 12-month gap, which is really easy to forget about because once you've done that project, you've done the insights, like you move on to the next project. Like we're going super fast at researchers, and there's a lot of pressure on us to continue to deliver insights, and we want our work to have impact. But and then maybe you switch projects or you move teams or go on to something else. Like it's really easy to drop this ball, and it's like such a simple thing. Even like after the fact, it's like, well, how do you kind of remember to pick up, or if you leave the company or whatever, like who else is picking that up and who else is taking responsibility for that data that you've created on behalf of that person?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and so what is the long tail implications of that? So I don't claim to know GDPR law all that well, which is actually funny in and of itself because it's still so new that even the courts don't seem to know the GDPR law and how to interpret that as well as they claim to. But what are the long tail implications of that, right? So you obtain that consent. The example you just gave is, okay, so you have that and you're able to use it in the way that they agreed to for 12 months. But what happens then? Like, what have you seen occur there?
Yeah, I mean, typically you need to tell them like how long you're going to keep that data for, right? That's one of the main things in the consent form. And then the expectation is that you delete that data after the fact. One of the strategies that I'm just rethinking about quite a bit at the moment is, okay, well, we'll take this data and then we'll just like fully anonymize that data. And then then at that point, it becomes not subject to, GDPR because it's about person identifiable data predominantly. But it's just like the more and more when you really look at anonymization, like you look at like how can you actually anonymize this stuff? I think that there's something about if you have a recording of someone telling the story or you have a snippet that's like an absolutely bomber quote that you're like, I want to put this quote in because it just beautifully articulates this point. And to really anonymize that, it's really difficult. And it also strips away the human, like the power of that storytelling. So it's even things like a voice is like a unique identifier. So you would end up with this kind of X-Files, like smoking man, muffled voice insights or whatever that would be in an organization. And like, I don't know if they would, I wonder on one hand if they would actually have the power to convey the story in the same way. But also, it's like we use anonymization as this, it's okay, we're going to anonymize your data. But it's like when you really look at what that means, like it's so difficult to actually do that. And the types of data that we're collecting as research, it's classified as like special category data under GDPR, because even if you just have a video of someone, like with you now, I can tell your gender, I can tell your ethnicity, I can tell all these like different things that we're not even talking about, but they're totally implicit just in the medium of like how we're capturing this data. So it's very difficult to sort of mask that, and whether or not you should or not. So I think that probably the longer, for me, I think the better strategy is to be like, let's just be more transparent upfront about what we're going to actually do with this and how this is going to work. And if people are comfortable with it, then just give them the agency to say so. But at least we're not being devious in any way or kind of masking things from people.
Yeah, for sure. Really good answer there. Really well explained. We have much bigger problems to tackle, but that would be a fun and also fairly useless startup where we could build something that just muffles people's voices and gives the X-Files filter to all this stuff and just say, yeah, isn't that cool? You throw all your audio and video in there. I don't think that's the right approach, but that would just be a funny...
Yeah, I thought about it. Really, I think there is legs in that though, I mean, because there's with anonymization, there's true anonymization of data, which is what you're trying to do is minimize the likelihood of statistical linkage with other data sets. Because when it's really with anonymization, it's when you combine it with other data sets. So on its own, you're I can't tell who this person is, but you put one or two other data sets in there. And then all of a sudden it's actually, I can tell who this person is now. Or I can narrow that person down to 10 people or 5 people or whatever. And then the more granularity that you have on that, the more you can get to it. So it's a bit like, I was watching the film, do you remember The Fugitive from the 90s with Harrison Ford? And it's kind of an old movie now, I guess, but it's a great film. But there's a bit in this where he's talking on the phone and they're trying to figure out, obviously trying to catch this guy. And they hear this train in the background. And he's, that's an elevated train. It's a very unique sound, and it's which cities in the US have elevated trains? And it's New York, wherever else he mentions, but they narrow it down to 3 cities immediately. So it's right out of this entire enormous country, you've just narrowed this down to these places. And then it's okay, now we look at where are all the payphones that are next to those things, and then narrow it down even further. And it's right, he's been to one of these spots. So even just from that one piece of information which is in the background, which you're not even thinking about, it's actually possible to really narrow that down to where someone is and re-identify them. And obviously, again, this is a sliding scale, right? So if you're doing a usability test with someone, it's probably not, depending on what you're testing, obviously. But if you're doing more in-depth ethnographic stuff with people, it's not as, I don't think we can really say for sure that it's we can definitely anonymize this data. But what we can do is identify stuff. So that's the blurring of a face or redaction of names, things like that, where you start to take out the kind of the clues, if you like, which link these pieces up. So yeah, I mean, I've started saying now on my consent forms where I'm not actually going to anonymize your data, I'm just going to de-identify your data. But then we usually have a conversation about that because, again, it's a weird, is it a weird technical sort of term or clause? Or is it, just needs a bit more explanation?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, I mean, share that explanation. I got to believe somebody goes, well, what does that actually mean? So how do you talk to them about that?
Yeah, so we just say, so basically, I'll just say it's really difficult to properly anonymize your data and what you tell us. There's still a risk that you could be re-identified. But what I do to try and minimize that as much as possible is I will redact certain pieces of information. So for example, I can blur your face. I can take your names out of it. If you talk about a place or whatever, we can do all that. But it really depends. I think that's really contextual based on the type of study that you're doing, because you've got this kind of trade-off of, is it, yes, you could do that with all data that you collect, but really is it, what's the risk? Again, so you're looking at this, making this risk judgment each time. And I think where this gets a bit tricky is that you're potentially making decisions, or we're making decisions based on the other person, right? So it's you're removing their agency away from them. And I think that's really an important point to pull out. So it's why I try to have the conversation with them and say, and I think this, going back to this kind of consent as a distribution license, one of the things we want to start exploring now is that we have these things like consent cards, essentially, which can travel with data. So it's this can potentially map onto a snippet. So if you're looking at a video in a repo, you could potentially see this is what we can actually do with this thing. So, and that could be, you could say I'm going to share it with my product team. I'm going to share it with the wider company or whatever, who else has access to this. But you could also say things like, what would you like me to do to this thing? Would you like me to blur your face? Would you like me to do whatever, redact your name or whatever? Or are you comfortable with all of that? But it gets really tricky because I think people don't fully always appreciate the consequences of what they're doing as well. So one of the questions I used to ask is, are you happy for me to share this publicly? And someone was like, yeah, that's fine. It's okay. How would you feel if this appeared on the side of a bus stop outside your home? And they were just well, no, I wouldn't like that. So I was like, well, that's what publicly means, right? It's that could be, you've just given us permission to essentially do that. So are you actually comfortable with that? I think a lot of the times, again, going back to the point about plain language and usability testing, is that these things like de-identification and anonymization and how you share the data, a lot of that is wrapped up in words which might not necessarily land with people when they're just thinking about it. So it's how can you reframe stuff to make that as clear as possible?
Yeah. And again, I think having that conversation rather than it just being in a form. And that really, to me, what I'm pulling out of what you're sharing is really almost at the heart of the differences between simple consent and then informed consent is like you're having a conversation with somebody, you're making sure they fully understand what they are consenting to, right? Which is just like why you add the word informed to it, but it also just really helps them understand what's happening instead of like this very clinical feeling type situation. And with all of that, we're talking a lot about data collection, of course. Now, Aurelius being a repository, people put a lot of data in there, and we get questions all the time, and I'm sure you do. So I want to ask you, because I want to hear your answer to this. How can we be GDPR compliant? How can we be CCPA compliant in how we're collecting data, how we're using it? Do you have tips for folks and ways that you typically answer that when they ask you?
Yeah, I think I can probably speak more to GDPR than CCPA, but typically in GDPR, there are 6 lawful bases for processing any data. And it's really straightforward when you look at it. This is that if you're going to do something with that data, like if you're going to put it to repo, if you're going to synthesize it, if you're going to share it with anyone, that's all counts as like processing data, right? That's what that means. And what's your lawful basis for that? So there are some, it could be a contract that you have with someone, it could be whatever, but typically for us as researchers, this is informed consent. And the risk around that really is, well, would the consent form that we've asked them to sign stand up in court, given how we've utilized this data? And that actually really is, it's almost like that this is a distribution license. So this is the thing which is going to protect us from it. So I think that I don't really have all the answers yet about, I think in the kind of like push-pull dynamic of like how we share data is changing. And also this kind of democratization of like research as well. It's almost like, how do we democratize like governance? It's like the next thing is like, how can we equally distribute that and share that out? And that's something that I think for me is, if you have this, is the best thing we can think of right now is can you get the consent form as close to that as possible? How can you be super transparent with what those permissions are, so that you don't want to be, someone isn't going to go into Aurelius, find a really great insight and then be like, oh, have we got permission to use this? Like, how do we do? And then I need to go into another system, like log into ConsentKit and see if we've got this and what we can actually do with it. It needs to be like there, right? And you want it to sort of live with that insight, but also in a way that is just very simple to understand. Like, we're humans too, and like we're Russian and all these other things. So it has to be very simple, very easy to get. And then I guess the other thing is like, how can you share that accountability, or maybe democratize that accountability out? So there's something you could do where you could easily see or just check, does this, who do we need to delete this? Or when do we need to delete this insight by? Can I actually use it in this context that I want to on this project? And who's the person who's responsible for this? If I have a question about it or whatever, and maybe I can go and ask them and talk to them. So all of these like strings are tied back. And really I think when you look at informed consent, if you go back to it as a paper form or as a PDF or a Word doc or something like this, that works as a format to sort of like convey information, not thinking about like accessibility and stuff like that. But it's like what this needs to do now. It feels like it's more than that. And that's really like why we built ConsentKit, is that it's actually, we need to take this and like, what's the innovation inside informed consent and how can it react to these challenges? It's not just transactional anymore. It's more relational now. And like, what does that mean in the sort of myriad of contexts that we're going to use this thing in?
Yeah. And it sounds like and this is the way all things happen. It's sort of a Tumblr effect, but that's what happened, in my opinion, with UX research repositories, right? Or this place to sort of centrally store, share, reuse research data, right? Is that we were using a lot of the tools that what I would call just general business tools. You mentioned a lot of them already: Word documents, PDFs, spreadsheets, whatever the case may be, to do that stuff. And then all of a sudden this new problem surfaced where, yes, we have that and it's doing it quote unquote well enough, until you realize that there are connections between these things that you can't make or you can't get easily without a bunch of additional effort. And it sounds to me that's what you're seeing and what's happening with consent now, particularly as people were focusing more and more on being compliant towards this with respect to GDPR. And
yeah, I was actually super curious about this. And one of the main things that we found really early doors, like we did a study around different organizations and like people within them, and like, how long does it take to do consent? Like, because you've got a number of jobs wrapped around that, right? So there's obviously the writing of the consent form, or even just finding the consent form. But you've got to ask someone, you get someone else, or you're pulling other people off projects that what they're doing. That might take 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever, or maybe longer to get a response back. So you've got to find this form. And then once you've got the form, you need to then rewrite this form and like maybe change the content, and it has to hit these kind of points that you need it to hit. And that requires a bit of skill, but also like it's a bit sort of previous knowledge, but also it's more time to think through that stuff. Then you've got to get this form out to people to sign it. And then you've got to maybe chase people who haven't signed it. You've got to go through this process of being in your inbox, going through email chains and being like, have they signed it? If they've not signed it, where's that up to? Like, what's going on with that? And then after the fact is, if you're keeping compliant with GDPR, you have to log the fact that all of these things are happening. So you have to say, well, when did I ask this person? What did I ask them? Like, what was the message that I sent to them? All of these different things. When you add all of these things up, we found that it was about 4 hours for every 5 participants who took part in research. So if you think about that in terms of total, it's like, I think we're really good at, design's become really good at looking outwards, but when we start to look at our own processes, it's like, wow, this is actually really inefficient. And that's probably the biggest like win that we found, like almost straight away, by solving like what are actually lots of like quite small, relatively straightforward to problems. But it's like when you put them all together, they become like, I mean, that's half a day. You could half a day for synthesis. It's like, what kind of difference would that make for your research? It's crazy.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad to hear that you did that and tried to quantify it in that way, because I actually think that as a UX industry, that's one of the things that we do not do well enough. And I say that blanket statement across the board, because this comes back to this larger conversation too about UX research having a bigger seat at the table, having more strategic influence in the direction and decisions that are getting made. I wish more people would think that way, because the same thing happens on sort of our end of the world, is where you look at all the tools you're using. You mentioned data synthesis, collection, capturing, searching. Every time somebody comes to you and says, hey, Phil, can you get me all the research we did about X, Y, or Z topic? Just think about how much time it takes you. And even just if it was nothing other than remove the time, but even just the cost of mental switch for you in all these different systems you got to look at, it adds up really quickly. And if you were to look at that at the end of a quarter, at the end of a year, I have a feeling that the number would surprise you. It would surprise a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that context switch in particular is massive. I mean, it takes, if I sort of switch from one thing to another thing, it takes me probably 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes at least to get my head back into what I was doing. It's not like you get to stop doing the thing that you were doing to do this other thing. It's expected to continue doing that other thing at the same time. And I think as well with COVID and like with this switch to remote working, I mean, I say even if I can give someone 10 minutes back, it's like a gift. It's that kind of context switch with everything else going on, even just like going through email chains and stuff, like the amount of like cognitive load that takes is huge. So that's one of the biggest like feedbacks that we have from people is it's just so easy to use, and it's just so much, it just brings everything up for you. So it's like that you can see exactly what's going on at a glance. And I think really like all the tools that we're using, like the more that we can do that, like that time and efficiency is really the biggest, and just headspace as well, because it's what we do is kind of like big stuff, right? It's like you're taking in like loads and loads of different bits of information. You're trying to craft that into a story or into some kind of thing. So, your head that's really difficult work to do. And if you're going to just get distracted by, I need to be back in my inbox. Have this person done it? Have they not done it? Whatever. And that's taking more and more time. It's really destructive. I think not only just in efficiency in terms of time saved, but also like, it's like the opportunity cost of that. It's like, what could you have been doing, which could have been furthering what you're actually there to do, which is obviously great research.
Yeah, of course. So that opportunity cost to me is the biggest one. I don't know if that's just because of my own bias or perspective, of course. But again, I come back to the synthesis one all the time, because that is actually the part that gets cut entirely or dramatically reduced almost every single time in research. And I feel like we all complain about it. We all say, I wish I had more time to sit with the data, figure out what it meant. But we're getting pushed and pressured and have to drive towards this answer to the question or the insights. And okay, so what are the next steps? What are the recommendations? And those all just get better the more time you have to really sit, marinate with the data and figure out what it is that you learned. But to your point, which is why I love that you brought this up, it's so critical to look at how our time is spent elsewhere. That yes, it seems, well, okay, I'm using quote unquote free tools, which by the way, they're never free. You're paying for them in some way. But I'm using this free tool to do this thing that costs me 10 minutes. I'm using this free tool to do this other thing that costs me 20 or 30 minutes. And if you do that, you start to scale it times 2, 3, 4, 5, you've lost a day or two. Boy, wouldn't it have been nice to have that day or two extra to sit with the data that you collected after you've done the research to really figure out what it meant. Like, what would that do for you? And that's actually really hard to quantify, because it is sort of a squishy, more ephemeral type thing. But the fact of the matter is that would have, I would place a high wager, a significant impact, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's harder to see that. But I mean, it's really, what would you do? What would this thing be like for you? What would that, those extra sort of 4 hours, what would you do with those 4 hours? Like, what would that be? And yeah, it's really one of the biggest wins that we can give people. If you're building any kind of technology, you're always trying to sort of innovate back to comfort. But I think to your point about scaling this as well, it's the next, just through the process of you figuring something out and figuring out a workflow almost by using these different tools. It's like you build up a lot of tacit knowledge about like how that workflow works, right? And that's the thing that you need to transfer to someone else to scale that thing. And when we were doing these early prototypes for ConsentKit, we were looking at, okay, let's use, Google Forms, for example, let's use a spreadsheet. It works like this. You need to then, add these bits in or whatever. And I found myself just writing tons and tons of like documentation and guidance. But it got to the point where I was like, well, I haven't got time to read all this stuff. And it's like, I just want it to like work for me. I want it to go. And that was one of the things that led us to thinking, okay, well, how do we actually scale this thing? Like it worked great for me, or I could get it to work great for one person. But then it's like, right, now I need to roll this out to a team of 20 researchers. And then you just hit a whole bunch of other problems. And I think this is one of the main drivers for like why we went down this product route, is that actually you can really onboard people to that very easily. And it's a process that they can follow. You can guide them through that with the design. So in a sense, an informed consent really is a process. It isn't just a single document. It's all of this other stuff around it. There's prompts to remind them to do things, remind them to delete the data and all this other stuff. So we managed to get it down to a point where it was like, literally, I'm doing an interview and I need a consent form. Boom, go. That's 85% of the form generated, and the remaining 15%, we've given you prompts to say, this is what you need to type into these bits. And it's just like super fast and super easy. And like the main thing is that it's just consistent as well. So you have everybody is doing it in the same kind of way. And that's, I think that's really the thing, is that scalability of these things, and being able to do that without needing to just retrain people how to do this stuff. I think that's one of the big things about research ops that's so exciting, is that really recognition of we're spending a lot of time doing this stuff and just figuring out process and stuff. And if we can have something where that's sort of almost done for us, or we figure out what those main processes are, we're able to automate those a lot, or to a thing in place that we can sort of distribute consistently across the teams. So I think that's huge.
Yeah, it sounds really cool. And that's one of those things too, where it's make this really complicated, hard to understand thing just easy for me. Honestly, and it's one of those things that you can't measure. It's making this really hard, complicated, maybe even time-consuming thing easy for me, that I can sort of offload that mental space to not have to focus on that, but then you free that up to do something else. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, as with most things in the world, but particularly most things that we do in our profession in UX, the conversation used to be like, how do I get somebody to care about UX? Then it was, how do I get somebody to care about UX research? Now, it sounds like what you're tackling is, how do I get somebody to care about consent? So I think most researchers, at least to some degree, care about consent. If they know about informed consent, awesome. But what I would love to ask you is just, how do I get somebody to care more about consent, to actually do this if they don't today, or if they don't recognize the need for it?
Yeah, I think there's like an ethical maturity almost in any practice, not just in design, but really in anything. And it's like on some level, you just need to learn how to do the thing first. And then as you get up, you become more and more interested in like things like ethics, for example, or things like compliance or whatever. You might get to a point in research and then something will take your interest and you'll be like, okay, I'm going to become about this, or I'm going to get more interested in this. I mean, for me, with informed consent, it's just something that like we have to do. But I think we actually did a survey on Twitter. It was only like a really short, those kind of short polls that you put out. And I was sort of curious about this, to be like, why do people get informed consent? Is it because they have to do it and it's a legal thing, or is it because it's the right thing to do? And do people recognize that? And it was like 97%, I think, of like respondents that came back were like, no, it's the right thing to do. I think people do recognize that. And because you're really talking about someone's rights, like almost like human rights, almost of privacy, and like what you're going to do with this data. And I think that's something which is more and more becoming on the radar about, okay, this is something that we need to think about. We need to care about this. Inclusivity and stuff like that is super, super important. It has been forever, but these seems to come in like trends, if you like, or it becomes a more and more important thing as we become more mature in our practices. And that's something that really, I think that people really will just develop that, really. They'll get that, or maybe they do already, but it's just barriers. There are barriers in the way to be like, actually, I don't know how to do this, or like how to do that. So what we've been trying to do is just really address those barriers and just remove as much friction from that as possible. And not just for the researcher, but also for the participant as well.
Yeah, totally. Really happy to hear you bring up the one point there in particular, and it helps us be more equitable and inclusive on how we do research. We had several episodes back now, but Alba Villamil on our podcast, and she does a lot of research with sort of like underserved populations, more vulnerable populations, and I think informed consent is one of the avenues in which you can do two things as a researcher. Number one, you can help build that comfort and rapport with somebody to actually have a real human conversation with them, number one. But then number two is it actually helps serve them better and help them understand their rights in that situation, which in a lot of those cases, in those underrepresented communities, that's not the case. I mean, traditionally, they just haven't been, right? And so this kind of helps empower them too with that, which is all going back to the answer you got, which is it's just the right thing to do. And I suppose if somebody doesn't care as much about that answer, you can always then say, well, you'd probably get fined a boatload if we don't do this properly, if we don't manage it properly after the fact. So if all else fails, I guess you can use the old carrot stick metaphor if you like. But
yeah, I hate selling it on that, because we should try to do this because we want to be better and we want to be fairer, right? And we want to be more equitable with people. But yeah, there is that. The fines are pretty massive. With GDPR, it's 20 million or 4% of like your global turnover or something like that. They're really significant.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Phil, this very detailed, very thorough conversation about not easy and not clear topic for a lot of folks. This was pretty great. We're running up to the end of our time. And so I ask this every episode, of course. And so I want to ask the same thing to you. Of everything we chatted about, if somebody came up to me and I had temporary amnesia or just completely forgot, and somebody said, all right, Phil, what was that episode all about? Can you summarize that for folks?
Yeah, the way that we're working is changing, and some of the things which enable us to do this work, or the mechanics of the work almost, maybe haven't necessarily been changing to adapt to those new needs. And obviously there's a very human aspect to informed consent, which is super important and very central to it, and the comprehension and things like that. But it's really like, how do we adapt and like move informed consent forward and evolve it so we can sort of continue to work in the ways that we're working and see the benefits of innovations in the field and also in other products and tools that we're using.
Awesome. Very well summarized. And something I wanted to add, because you've brought this up a couple times, innovating in that space is really interesting to me. As we talked about efficiencies and inefficiencies, creating efficiencies with this frees up mental space, other energy to innovate elsewhere. Right. And I think that's a really interesting thing to let sit with folks who are listening and consider as an opportunity. But I do need to be respectful of your time, because I know that we're running out of it here. But is there anything you want to share with folks today that we didn't already have a chance to cover?
I think probably maybe accessibility would probably be the big one. Like, I feel like I'm talking about this a lot at the moment. It always amazes me how unaccessible like a lot of things are, and like in the sort of products and services that we're building. Because of COVID, this has been exacerbated even more. And obviously people are like physically restricted from going out. And if your only connection to the world is through a computer, it's something that is really important. And as we're doing research, if you're asking people if this thing that you're sending them, which represents their rights and is going to help towards their like kind of psychological sort of safety, if you like, or understanding what it is that you're there and what it is that you're doing, making sure that's accessible is like super. It's also really important, because I think it's like 20% of people have some kind of accessibility need, and by not ensuring that we're doing that's really excluding a lot of people from the processes. So yeah, I would say I'd just put that in, I guess, at the end. That's something that I think it's been on our radar from day one, and yeah, I think it's something that's, again, like when we're not looking at our own processes or not assessing our own processes too much, it's something that can be overlooked, but it's obviously very important.
Yeah, totally. Awesome. Phil, this was a really good chat. I certainly learned a few things, even though I work in a similar space. So I really appreciate you coming on, sharing your advice, answering the questions, and having a chat with me today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's been really great. I'm a huge fan of the podcast as well, so I look forward to future episodes.
Awesome. I appreciate you saying that. All right, everybody, we will see you next time. This podcast is brought to you by Aurelius, the research and insights tool that helps you analyze, search, and share all your research in one place, so you can go from data to insights to action faster and easier. Check out Aurelius for yourself with a 30-day trial by going to aureliuslab.com. That's AURELIUSLAB.com. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean a lot if you would give us a review on iTunes to let others know what you think. You can catch all new episodes of the Aurelius podcast almost anywhere you listen to podcasts, like iTunes, Spotify, and more. Stay up to date when new episodes come out by signing up for our email updates on our website.